For those of you who I haven't met, I'm Scott Meyers and part of the Racial Justice Committee that Dana and Laura are chairs of. And one of the things that we are trying to do on the committee in this early stage of our existence is really focus on education. And some of you have been on one of the previous calls. Some of you may have visited the website or the web page on the KUC website. Our focus really over the next, 3 or 4 months, certainly while we're in this period where we're all kind of quarantined, is just to try and share information. If you haven't been to the page on the website, one of the things that we're focusing on is kind of some of the history of the Jim Crow era. And you'll find a number of articles, videos, TED Talks, things like that about that. We're actually going to be changing some of that information over in the coming days and changing the focus to be more on criminal justice and what has been the kind of the historical relationship between Blacks and the criminal justice system. And part of that will be another talk next Monday that is going to be on the Bail Project. You may have seen in the newspaper recently that the Illinois House passed a law, major criminal justice reform. Part of that is eliminating cash bail. There is a national organization that George Wishart has been a part of bringing here to Chicago called the Bail Project, which is focused on this very issue of what's the justice behind cash bail? How does cash bail affect the African-American population? So we'll be delving into that next week in a talk, but you'll find more information like that coming soon on the website. So please, when you have time, take a look at the website. It's as I said, it's focused on Jim Crow era now and will be updated in the coming days. So tonight, we have Todd Maxman, who is a history teacher at New Trier High School, who is joining us. Todd has been focusing his own personal research and some of his teaching and working with students around the issue of race relations and racial justice on the North Shore and kind of looking at it from a historical perspective. So we thought that, it would be kind of good to have one of these conversations where we start in our own backyard and what has been some of the history here. I won't put anybody on the spot, but as Todd goes through his talk, some of you may have been living on the North Shore long enough so that some of it maybe isn't history, but it's part of your life and you may be familiar with some of it. But we'll go ahead. Todd will give a talk for probably about 30 minutes or so. And then we'll have time for questions and answers. Just some quick background. Todd's been teaching at New Trier for about, what do you say, 55 years, Todd?
Seems like it. 25.
So he spent 5 years in the U.S. Navy and then found his way to teaching into New Trier and has been teaching history to a lot of our kids for, the better part of a generation. So Todd, go ahead.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's so nice. I've been, let's see, I grew up in Evanston and I went to college for a little while at Indiana and then I was in the Navy. And then my wife and I moved our 2 kids up here and I live on Isabella in Wilmette. And we've been here for almost 2 years now. So I'm a member of the community now. So let me just start by saying this is, I've been teaching at New Trier. I'm a history teacher. I'm a trained historian in that way. And so I bring that sort of perspective to it. I'm no local history expert. I'm sort of a generalist in social studies, but that's what I've been doing at New Trier for the better part of 25 years. I did take some time off during that time, although I was working in the building. I was the junior boys advisor chair. So my students usually like the Navy stories and they like the advisor chair stories during those downtimes. So I've got some good advisor chair stories if we want to. But what I thought we'd do is I'd take you through some slides that talk about just my history, my interaction, my journey, if you will, to try to be, to sort of operate from an anti-racist standpoint, and to talk about some of the work that I and my students have done in the last few years. So I'm a co-sponsor of the group Student Voices in Equity, that's been dedicated to these issues of social justice and anti-racism for, that group's been going for like 8 or 9 years strong. And then because of the state requirement to have a civics course, my co-teacher and I, Amory DeSerpa, created a course called Civics and Social Justice. That'll get you civics credit if you give us a year. So it'll give you some social studies credit. So it's this great cohort of activists. And if you come back your senior year, we'll give you a credit in leadership and social justice. And that course is in its first year. So we're in the 3rd year of the civics and social justice course. So I'm really excited about that work that our students are doing there. But let me take you through some local history, if everybody can sort of see the screen now. And I want to recognize that we are only 2 weeks out from this major event. And so if we're going to talk about race and racism in this country, I can't not mention the attack on the Capitol building and the fact that race and racism had a lot to do with that group. And as a veteran, to also recognize that many of the people in this action not only looked like me, but were veterans as well. And so for me to deal with that, to own the fact that I am a veteran and perhaps give an alternative vision of what it means to be a veteran is very important to me. I want to just stop for a minute and talk about this one. So there's a part of me that's a history teacher that wants to be shocked and to talk about the Civil War and the fact that the Confederate battle flag never actually made it into the Capitol. And there's a part of me that wants us to look beyond that and to look at the portraits behind this gentleman, this one and this one. And so in the background, you have Charles Sumner, who was an abolitionist from Massachusetts, who, after he gave a speech on the floor of the Senate, was beaten so badly by a US Representative, Preston Brooks, he actually had brain damage. He did not return to the Senate for 3 years. So violence in the Capitol and racism in the Capitol is nothing new, although this is really shocking. The other man on the other side is John Calhoun, who he had a bunch of different roles, probably should have been president at one point, was vice president, but he was sort of an avowed racist and defender of the planter class in the South, and talked about how slavery was actually beneficial for Black people. So that's just like, there's just so much happening in that one photograph. And then 2 weeks later, you have this amazing woman. So Amanda Gorman, who gave, I think hands down, like the most memorable moment for me watching inaugurations in recent, like, I don't know, it was really stunning in 2008 or 9 during the first Obama administration for me to see a Black man do that. But then her vision of America was just amazing. I linked to her audio. I don't know if people have heard that. It is worth 5 minutes of your time to hear her recite her poem, The Hill We Climb. I like this photograph because you get the different people, and then particularly Vice President Harris in the frame as well. But then this is just a section from her poem that she calls The Hill We Climb, If Only We Dare. It's because being an American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. And so I think what I'd like to do with this presentation is to have us question the history that I was given as a white, straight, cisgendered male, like that I was sort of the primary actor in all of these, and that somehow we're beyond racism. And so for me to go back and to look at not only my history, but the history of New Trier and the North Shore through the lens of race is to involve me and people who look like me in that, in an uncomfortable way. And so this is, we'll talk about some texts that have informed me in the courses and the way that I teach. And this is a big one. How to be an anti-racist. I don't know if people have bumped into this. It's Ibram Kendi, who's written a bunch of different books. Stamped from the Beginning is his major historical text. If people are into that, it's a big like doorstop book. But if you're into history like I am, like that is definitely one to pick up. I also want to recognize sort of time and place too. So we're not too far from celebrating Dr. King's life and work, and to recognize there is a local connection, right? So he spoke at the Winnetka Green. He spoke there for a reason. He spoke about segregation and how it affects housing. Now, he spoke about a lot, but I want us to hold both visions. You've got this vision of hope by Dr. King, and at the same time, you have people protesting that. Now, it was a small group. It was a group of neo-Nazis. They were surrounded and shouted down. At the same time, it is important for us to recognize that both things happened on the same day in the same place. So we look back, and I try to sort of look at myself and place myself in this historical narrative as well. And we can look at the demographics of our community and of our school, and I'm in this big chunk of blue. Like often, like I need to recognize that. We can focus on people of color here, but in a predominantly white institution, race works in certain, and I would say predictable ways. And so I started working at New Trier, and I quickly sort of got involved in initiatives like SEED, which is a program called Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity. I would go to different workshops. I started working with Student Voices in Equity. And there was one year where we did a partnership with Thorn Ridge High School. Thorn Ridge. It's down in Dalton by like Calumet City. So like beyond the south side of the city. And when we got these two groups together, I don't know, we had just finished like sort of going around to classes with each other and talking. And we just had like pizza, and they're just being teenagers and they're hanging around. And we're looking at each other and we're seeing the disparities. And so Thorn Ridge is 96.1% African-American. New Trier is just below 80% now white. And so we can talk about the different ethnic groups and racial groups at New Trier. It's sort of interesting for us to look at it, but it's a predominantly white, although not all white, school. And at some point, there's always one beautiful student in here who just says the obvious and asks that great question. And it was a girl from Thorn Ridge who was just looking at everybody and saying, how did this happen? How did this happen? She was like, wow, she just told the truth. And sort of, there were history teachers in the room, including myself, and we had to say, it was absolutely intentional. This does not happen by mistake. And to sort of own that and help kids and us sort of process through this, we need to go back into our history and to look at maps like this. And so these are sort of the famous redlining maps that came out of the, it was the introduction of the FHA in the 1930s, although these practices predate it and actually still have effects. And so you can look at a map of the New Trier district, and this little section here, literally redlined, literally in red colored, that was the black section of Glencoe, right around St. Paul's AME. This was the place that African Americans were allowed by FHA rules to purchase. They got different deals, and they were higher interest rates. Sometimes they couldn't even get an FHA loan, and then they would need to go sort of in the submarket and talk about like the Contract Buyers League. And so there's a whole history of this. This is ownership, home ownership, and this is wealth creation. That's how it functions in America. So I think a lot of us pay attention to these racial restrictions and restrictive covenants, they were called. And this is just one off the internet. I've had students actually come in and bring me theirs when I talk about restrictive covenants from different locations. And I think we pick on Kenilworth and we pick on Winnetka. There were restrictive covenants all over the place. There were ones in Wilmette as well. There were ones in certain sections of Evanston. So this was not an unheard of practice. In fact, they're probably still in your title somewhere. So if you have all your documents, they're probably in there because they're part of the legal title. They're unenforceable now, of course, but they're still there. That language sort of still exists. But beyond those restrictive covenants in somebody's title, these redlining maps were sort of crucial for home ownership. So I'm going to go sort of personal with this and to talk about my history. So when I grew up in Evanston, right here, I grew up in a place called the Backlat. I don't know if anybody knows that. It was by the Swedish retirement home, and then it was like right close to Lincolnwood School is right here. So this is just a little section of my life. So here I was living up here, went to school here, went to school over here in Haven. And then when I went to high school, I would ride my bike down here, cross McCormick. People know where it is. So the Ecology Center is right here. Go down here. Sometimes I go down Dodge. Sometimes I go to one of these side streets. And this is ETHS here every day. That was my path every day. Never knowing that as soon as I crossed the bridge on the right-hand side, on the south side of Bridge Street there, right across the canal is this building. It looks like this now. I just went like, this was like 3 days ago I took this picture. This is a home for physically disabled adults. Now, it's been that way since I think the 80s is when they started this.
90s.
90s, sorry. I'm taking myself here, sorry. This was the Community Hospital of Evanston. This is the Black Hospital. This is the Black Hospital. Black people were not allowed in Evanston Hospital until the 1950s. No idea. No one talked about it. No one mentioned it. Black people were not allowed in Evanston Hospital until the 1950s. If they were born in Evanston, they were born in the community hospital, or the hospital actually started by an African-American couple, and their home should be on the historical record. It's like 3 doors down from Heckey's. People, it's like right on Asbury there. That's just a little piece of my history. So growing up in, like, no one talked about it, no one knew that. And so for me to think back about and to reflect on my past, even my time in the Navy, and I can see how race was operative. I can look at that and be discomforted. And at some point, Ibram Kendi challenges me to just label it as what it is, racism. And so I can look back and to think that things were sort of neutral and I tried to be a good person. And I was really informed. This was, I think it was a fresh air between these two very important thinkers, Robin DiAngelo and Resmaa Menakem. And they were having this dialogue back and forth with what was going on. And Robin DiAngelo says, when white people ask me, what do I do? She talks about keeping herself in this uncomfortable place. Because for her, the comfort of white people has always been privileged over the safety of people of color. And the cost of my comfort has been borne by people that don't look like me. And so I can look back at my grandparents, and they were loving people. They're great. They have passed. They've died a bunch of years ago now. They espoused racist beliefs. They did. They were not shy about it. They didn't didn't have huge yard signs about it, but they used the N-word, and people would sort of roll their eyes and would sort of laugh and move on. My grandfather was, he was an executive at GE for a lot of years. He was a veteran. He was in World War II. He was in the Marines. And when he got out, he took advantage of the GI Bill as a way to gain credit to get him into the airline industry. And that's how, and that was just sort of that was part of his story, how race played a part. It doesn't take much to sort of look through that to see. We could talk about sort of the racist way in which the GI Bill was actually administered. We could talk about the fact that even in World War II, as we're fighting for freedom, you're talking about a segregated force. And so troops were segregated. There were black troops and white troops. And if you look far enough back at their history, they both met. This is Betty and Walt Van Dyne, my maternal grandparents. They met in church. They met in church doing shows, doing like entertainment at the time in the 1930s. So this is 1937. There's my grandfather and my grandmother is up here. There are many pictures that look just like this one. And so I need to say, like, I'm going to show some uncomfortable pictures, of white people dressing up as people of color. I'm going to show some pictures of blackface. I'm going to show my grandparents in blackface. That's them right here. The fact that they did these shows seems so normal to them. These were vaudeville shows, they were comedy shows, they were used as entertainment for white people. So I remember my mother talking about it, we were sort of going through those things after they had died, and I was like, oh my God, Mom, these pictures of Grammy and Grandpa, like, they're in blackface. She was like, oh, everybody did that. I'm like, oh, my white people did that. White people did that. So to think about that, like, how does that then relate to us today, sort of back to New Trier, and to talk about how did we get here? How are we beneficiaries of that particular history? We can go back to the map again, and then we can look at New Trier's history in its yearbooks, and it has a pretty decent archive. In fact, my wife is the one who runs the archive. And there are lots of pictures. This is actually a big one. This actually, if people know, there's a big like coffee table book on the history of New Trier. And this is one of the first pictures that you see. These are people in one of the very early classes. This is a class of just random students from 1911 and 1912. So New Trier opened in 1901. And this is Thomas Watts. The Watts family lived in Glencoe, right at Randolph and Adams, right in that red section. And he went to New Trier. So New Trier is a public school. It was not segregated at the time in some ways. In some ways. This is taken in 1912. This is an article in the Chicago Tribune in 1913. The very next year. So as Thomas Watts is attending New Trier High School, there was a meeting in Wilmette of white people who were so concerned about the possibility of black people owning property in Wilmette that they had a meeting. They were so concerned about this. So what does this have to do 100 years or so ago with what's happening now? I would argue that we're the inheritors of these kinds of policies and incidents as we go on. So we sort of skip forward and do some sort of classic New Trier history. There's a Life magazine in 1950, and like, look how great. And they had these really cool classrooms and teachers teaching on the lawn. And we could talk about the swimming pool, which was this great thing. New Trier is actually arguably one of the first schools to have, public schools to have an indoor swimming pool. One of the first schools to have that. It was actually redone as a WPA project in the 1930s under the New Deal. And so I show my students this picture, besides being weirded out by the fact that it's all guys and they are all naked. They also note, if you look at it long enough, you realize they are all white. Because New Trier, even though it wasn't segregated, did not allow black people, black students in the pool until the late 1950s. Pools, beaches, public accommodations were that sort of ground zero, the fight against or fight for segregation, or the fight against, or the fight to desegregate. And so there are there's some really great videos and books out now about beaches. And to think back, like 1919 was the big race riot in Chicago, which was caused by a black boy who had drifted into the white beach, and he was literally stoned to death. They threw rocks at him, and it sparked 3 days of really bloody riots in Chicago. So that was the 1950s. So my class then, civics and social justice, and other students from Student Voices and Equity decided, and this was about the time when you started to see some politicians who were having to answer for college yearbooks, and some of their yearbooks where these were white politicians in blackface. And so we did what we called a racial audit. We went through about 98% of the yearbooks at New Trier, and we found a number of different, I would say, disturbing images throughout them. This is just a handful, and so recognized for many, many years. It was the New Trier Indians, or was New Trier East, and so that was our mascot. And so you had a lot of people, white people, dressing up as Native Americans. I did this too. So like I recognized, like I was an Indian guide when I was little. Like my dad like was working all the time, and like he would take us on these camping trips, and we did this as well. It was normalized in that way. It doesn't make it any less racist. It's just something for us to look at. And then, yeah, there was out and out, like no doubt, blackface. And so in a lot of the yearbooks, some of these are really early. This is like the 1920s. This was in the teens. And this one was right during World War II. So students who were clearly dressing in blackface and using that in all kinds of sort of humorous or entertainment ways. The performing arts department has, and I think they've really done a good job about being very forward about this, looked back at their history. And there were many shows over the years where students would be in what we would call brownface now. This is just out and out blackface. That was a show about it's Cry Beloved Country, which is about a Black Catholic priest in the townships. And this is, oh, I'm forgetting the name of the show. I'll have to look it up. But it's like a World War II show. So there were students in what we call yellowface now, pretending to be Asian or Japanese at the time. It's worth me pausing here, and I'm getting to the end, so I'll try to make this a little quicker. Finnishs Rainbow was done twice at New Trier. That is a really fascinating show in and of its own. It was done in the 80s, and it was done in the 1960s. So I'll go back and forth. This is a show where, so it was written in the 40s, and it was intended to be sort of questioning about racism. And so it's in the South, and white racist mayor, sort of by the magic of, the musical theater, gets turned black. And he goes through this show, and they have like vaudeville things. They have people in blackface. So he gets to experience sort of racism as a black man, right? So, but wait for it. Because he learns his lesson, what do you think happens in the end? What's his reward?
It's turned back to being white.
He gets to be white again. So like, it's so problematic on any number of levels. But then you had black students actually right next to students who were clearly in blackface. This is not the only place where you can find examples. This happened actually twice. There were protests and letters written to the board in the 70s and then in the 80s about New Trier's use of Huckleberry Finn. And the experience that Black students had reading that along with white students, the use of the N-word, the use of those racial stereotypes. And it took years, it took decades of work for their experiences to actually be heard. And we no longer have that as a primary text in American Studies. We did when I started. And we got away with it because American Studies was considered an option. So if you didn't want to read Huckleberry Finn, you couldn't take American Studies. You can get out of it that way. So it's just sort of interesting to look in a number of different places. This is just a girls' club brochure from the 60s. And it was a sort of tongue-in-cheek joke like welcome to the jungle. And all throughout this little girls' club yearbook, there were these really sort of racist African stereotypes of cannibals and those kinds of things. So sort of back to a more current history, if you will, my group of students sat outside of the cafeteria for about a week And we just had blank sheets of paper that said, what is it like to be blank at New Trier? And we got amazing responses from what's it like to be Black? What's it like to be Mexican? What's it like to be dyslexic? What's it like to be broke at New Trier? Heartbreaking, wrenching stuff. What's it like to be queer and non-binary at New Trier? So lots of expressions of students who wanted their identities validated and their pain at least acknowledged. But I have to tell you that it was the students of color who spoke loudly. And we did this 6 years ago and presented this to the administration and the Board of Education. And so I want to use this as a way to say, we're trying to move forward. So out of the yearbook, and we're now 2 years out from that yearbook racial audit. It took 2 years of us presenting to the administration, and those students who are now seniors, most of them were sophomores when they did this, they're now seniors. And I have like 10 of them in that leadership class right now, which is so great. It took 2 years of them doing that work, presenting it to the administration and not letting it go. And just this summer, the superintendent wrote a letter and it was approved by the Board of Education that actually acknowledges the fact that these racist images exist in our yearbooks and we're trying to do better. I also want to recognize that this pandemic, and we're in this Zoom situation, that it has hit communities of color much harder, much differently than it does me or my family. And that is not any different at New Trier than it is anywhere else. And so if you actually look at the numbers of kids who are fully remote versus the kids who've chosen to attend school in our hybrid model, you've essentially made the kids in front of you at New Trier that is a whiter group of students. Many of our students of color have chosen to be fully remote for absolutely legitimate reasons. How we deal with that, like how we actually acknowledge that, how that changes our practice, that I want to question that. I want to have that conversation with my colleagues. And then the summer, and recognizing the tragedies that we continue to see on the news, the murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and so many others, there's no mistake that the Black Lives Matter March started at New Trier High School and ended up on the Winnetka Green. During that whole summer, I was planning my classes and trying to collaborate with there are a number of different affinity groups and equity groups at New Trier, and trying to collaborate with them. We started to see lots of these statements from this account on Instagram called Untold New Trier, and a number of different change.org petitions with not only students of color, but our white students saying, we need to directly address this issue, that it's not ideologically neutral, that we need to actually acknowledge how whiteness has affected New Trier and white supremacy, and to be very honest and upfront about it. So I want to go back to this statement about holding on to my discomfort as a part of what I do in trying to become an anti-racist. I think it's this journey. So you're never sort of there, at least from my point of view. And that always recognizing that my comfort, my privilege has a cost, and it's borne by people who don't look like me. I'll try to end up on this sort of really positive note. I don't know if anybody heard or listens to NPR and the StoryCorps. And so the morning of Dr. King, Martin Luther King Day, they had this story from Clara Jean Esther, who was a student in Memphis and actually was there the morning he was shot. She was working to support that sanitation worker strike where Dr. King was down to speak. And she ended with this amazing, thought pattern where she talked about how devastating it was to have Dr. King shot and how much anger was in her. And that she wants to believe that Dr. King's life changed everything, that she's witnessed George Floyd's and so many others who've lost their lives. And so it's this holding on to both. In my class, we call it the alternative and the dominant narrative, this dominant narrative that wants us to believe, that wants people like me to believe that we're essentially good and that we've sort of solved racism. And she's saying, no, that hasn't happened, but it's not going to kill his dream. It's not. And so I have to hold both of those with me and to remain positive and like sort of accept the fact like pessimism is a tool of white supremacy. If I get despondent and think that things aren't going to change, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy and I have to resist that. So I think with that, okay, I've gone over just a little, but we have plenty of time for comments. I'll stop sharing.
That's great. Thank you, Todd. Thanks very much. And I do want to open it up for questions here. You know, before I do, I'll kick it off with a first question.